Imagine living thousands of years ago with no television, no music apps, no games, no internet, and no endless stream of entertainment. So when the hunt was over, how did ancient humans actually fight boredom? The archaeological and anthropological evidence reveals that our ancestors didn't simply sit around waiting for something to happen. They played, created art, made music, told stories, competed, explored, and invented ways to turn ordinary time into something meaningful. Watch until the end, because the answer reveals something surprising. The human need for entertainment, creativity, laughter, and connection may be far older than civilization itself, and it helps explain why boredom still drives us to create today. Right now, you have 47 apps on your phone, a streaming service with 10,000 things to watch, a podcast for every topic that has ever existed, and somehow you still get bored. So here's a question nobody thinks to ask. What did ancient humans do when they were bored? Not medieval humans, not ancient Romans, not even ancient Egyptians. We're going back further than that. 100,000 years, 200,000 years, back when there was no writing, no art, no music, no language as we know it. Just people sitting there with nothing to do. The answer changes everything we think we know about creativity, religion, and why your brain works the way it does. But first, did boredom even exist back then? This is actually a serious scientific debate. For a long time, researchers assumed our earliest ancestors were too busy surviving to get bored. Every waking hour was hunting, foraging, building shelter. There was no downtime. But that assumption turned out to be wrong, very wrong. In 1966, anthropologist Marshall Salins published a paper that flipped everything. He had spent years studying the Kungan people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last groups on Earth still living something close to the original human lifestyle. What he found was this. They worked on average about 15 to 20 hours per week. That's it, not per day, per week. The rest of the time they rested, they talked, they sat, they did nothing in particular. Salins called them the original affluent society, not because they had stuff, because they had time, more free time than most modern humans ever get. So the question isn't whether ancient humans got bored. The question is, what happened when they did? Let's start with the obvious one. They played. This sounds simple. It isn't. In 2010, archaeologist Francesco Darro and his team studied a collection of shells found at a site in South Africa called Blomos Cave. The shells were 75,000 years old. They had holes drilled through them, and they were coated in red ochre. These weren't tools. They weren't weapons. They weren't food. They were beads. Someone had sat down 75,000 years ago with nothing better to do and made themselves jewelry. That's the oldest known art object in human history. And it started with boredom. But here's what's really interesting. Making those beads would have taken hours, maybe days. Drilling through a shell with a stone tool, without electricity, without metal, without patience built by a lifetime of entertainment. That is a long afternoon, and they did it anyway. Because the alternative was staring at the wall of a cave. Necessity didn't invent art. Boredom did. The same pattern shows up in music. In 2008, researchers excavating a cave in southern Germany found a flute. It was made from the bone of a vulture. It had 5 finger holes. It was 40,000 years old. Someone 40,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before any civilization we would recognize, sat down and invented music. Not because they had to, because they had a free afternoon and a bird bone. And it turns out music is what the brain does when it has nothing else to process. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, who studies the origins of music, argues that musical ability is older than language. Our brains were wired for rhythm and melody before we could form complex sentences. Because rhythm is pattern recognition, and pattern recognition kept us alive. But boredom didn't just invent art and music. It invented something far more powerful. It invented imagination. Think about this. You cannot be bored without a concept of time. To be bored, you have to know that this moment is lasting too long, that something else could be happening, that the future exists and it could be better than right now. Boredom is, in a very real sense, the first sign that a brain has developed the ability to imagine things that don't exist yet. Animals don't get bored the way humans do. A dog waiting for its owner isn't bored. It's just waiting. It doesn't have a concept of what else it could be doing. But a human sitting in a cave 100,000 years ago, staring at the fire, nothing to do, starts to think, what if the hunt goes wrong tomorrow? What if that sound outside is a predator? What's beyond that mountain? Where do we go when we die? Every question religion has ever asked, Every question philosophy has ever asked, every question science is still trying to answer, all of them started the same way. Someone was bored, and their mind started wandering. In 2013, psychologist Sandy Mann published research showing that boredom significantly increases creative output. She had people perform the most boring tasks she could devise, copying numbers from a phone book, and then tested their creativity immediately afterward. The bored group dramatically outperformed everyone else because boredom forces the brain to generate its own stimulation, and the brain, when left to its own devices, is extraordinary. But there's one more thing ancient humans did when they were bored, and it's the one that mattered most. They talked. Not about hunting, not about food, not about logistics. They told stories. Anthropologist Robin Dunar, the same researcher who discovered that human social groups naturally cap at around 150 people, spent years studying what humans talk about when they're not talking about anything important. His finding, roughly 65% of all human conversation is social gossip. Who did what? Who said what? What happened to someone you both know? This sounds like a waste of time. It wasn't. Dunar argues that language itself evolved not for practical communication, but for social bonding. Before language, primates bonded by grooming each other physically, but grooming takes time. It's one tune. You can only groom one friend at a time. Language replaced grooming. Now you could bond with 3 people at once. 10. A whole group around a fire. You could tell a story about someone who wasn't even there. You could build trust with people you'd never touched. Language, and therefore human civilization, didn't emerge because we needed to coordinate hunts. It emerged because we were sitting around with nothing to do, and we started talking about each other. Boredom invented gossip, and gossip invented society. So, here's where we've ended up. 75,000 years ago, someone bored in a cave made a bead. 40,000 years ago, someone bored in a different cave made a flute. And somewhere in between, people sitting around fires with nothing to do started asking questions no one had answers to, about death, about the sky, about why things are the way they are. And some of those questions became religion. Some of them became science. Some of them became art. Some of them became you. Lying awake at 2 a.m., with your phone on your chest, thinking about nothing in particular. Here's the part nobody talks about. Modern psychology has a term for what happens when you eliminate boredom completely. They call it cognitive overload. When every moment is stimulated, the brain never gets the chance to do what it was built to do in the quiet moments. Process, consolidate, create. The default mode network, the part of your brain that activates when you're doing nothing, is the same network responsible for creativity, self-reflection, and empathy. It only turns on when you're bored. We spent 300,000 years learning to fill silence with something meaningful. Then we invented the smartphone, and we've been filling silence ever since. But every time you put the phone down and sit with nothing for a moment, every time your mind starts to wander and you let it, you're doing the same thing the person in the cave was doing. The same thing that made the bead, the same thing that made the flute, the same thing that looked up at the stars and started asking why. Boredom didn't hold ancient humans back. It's what made them human, and it might be doing the same thing for you if you let it. And maybe that is the uncomfortable truth hidden behind all of this. For most of human history, there was no escape from an empty moment, no glowing screen waiting in your pocket, no endless stream of videos designed to capture the exact second your attention begins to drift. If you were sitting beside a fire and nothing urgent needed to be done, you had only a few choices. You could sleep. You could talk, you could make something, you could play, or you could simply sit there and let your mind go somewhere else. And that last option may have been more important than we realize. Because a wandering mind is not an inactive mind. When the body is resting, the brain can still be connecting memories, replaying experiences, imagining future situations, and searching for patterns. An ancient hunter sitting quietly after a successful hunt might replay every detail of the day without consciously trying to. Where did the animal first appear? Which path did it take? What mistake almost caused the hunt to fail? What could be done differently tomorrow? What looks like doing nothing can actually be learning. The same may have been true for gathering plants, making tools, navigating landscapes, or remembering the behavior of animals. In a world without notebooks, maps, or digital storage, the human mind was one of the most important tools a person possessed. Memory had to be exercised constantly. Stories helped preserve it. Repetition strengthened it. Songs made information easier to remember. Games may have turned difficult skills into something children actually wanted to practice. And this is where play becomes much more than entertainment. A child throwing a small stick might be practicing the movements needed to throw a spear. A group of children chasing each other might be developing speed, balance, and social awareness. Mock fights could teach the body how to react under pressure. Games involving hiding and searching might develop tracking skills. Rhythm and dancing could strengthen coordination between members of a group. Of course, we cannot look directly into a cave 100,000 years ago and watch exactly what people did when they had free time, but when anthropologists study human societies and when archaeologists examine the earliest evidence of art, ornamentation, music, and symbolic behavior, one thing becomes difficult to deny. Humans have always done things that go beyond immediate survival. That matters. Because survival alone does not explain why someone spends hours carving a pattern into bone. Survival does not completely explain why people decorate their bodies. It does not explain rhythm, dance, storytelling, or the enormous amount of energy humans devote to humor and play. At some point, being alive was not enough. Humans wanted life to be interesting. And boredom may have been one of the pressures that pushed us in that direction. Imagine a small group during a long period of bad weather. Hunting is limited. Travel is difficult. Everyone is forced to remain close to camp. There are only so many times you can sharpen the same tool, only so much food to prepare. Eventually, someone starts doing something different. Maybe they tap a rhythm against a piece of wood. Someone else joins in. A child begins copying the pattern. Another person laughs because they do it badly. And suddenly, what began as an empty afternoon becomes a shared activity. Nobody planned to invent entertainment. It emerged naturally from human beings trying to make time feel meaningful. That pattern may be one of the oldest patterns in our species. Something happens, someone repeats it, someone improves it, someone teaches it, and eventually, generations later, it becomes tradition. A rhythm becomes music, a game becomes a ritual, a story becomes a myth, a joke becomes part of a culture, a decorative pattern becomes a symbol. And suddenly, the thing that may have started simply because people had time on their hands has become something larger than any individual who created it. This is also why the campfire may have been one of humanity's greatest inventions, not just because it produced heat, but because it created a completely new kind of time. Before controlled fire, darkness placed severe limits on what humans could safely do. But a fire extended the day. It created a circle of light in the middle of an otherwise dangerous landscape. People could remain awake together after the practical work of survival had slowed down, and around that fire something unusual happened. During the day, attention was directed outward. Where is the food? Where is the danger? Where are the children? Which direction are we traveling? But at night, when the group was gathered and relatively safe, attention could turn inward. That is when stories become especially powerful. Stories do something extraordinary. They allow one person to experience something that did not happen directly to them. You can hear about a hunt you never joined, a place you have never visited, a person who died before you were born, an animal you have never seen. In a sense, storytelling allows the human mind to travel through time. And once a species can do that, boredom becomes something dangerous in the best possible way. Because an unstimulated mind does not always remain empty. Sometimes it begins creating worlds. A child asks why the moon follows them. An adult invents an answer. Someone else improves that answer. Generations repeat it until the explanation becomes a story about gods, ancestors, spirits, or the beginning of the world. We may never know exactly when the first myth was told. There is no archaeological site where someone wrote, "Tonight, humanity invented storytelling." But the evidence of symbolic behavior tells us that, over tens of thousands of years, humans increasingly lived inside worlds filled with meaning that could not simply be touched or eaten. Animals became symbols. Colors carried significance. Burials sometimes reflected ideas about death. Objects were decorated beyond their practical function. The human mind was doing something new. It was taking reality and adding imagination to it. And perhaps that is the real opposite of boredom. Not stimulation, creation. Modern humans often think the cure for boredom is to consume something. Watch another video, open another app, listen to another person, scroll until something interesting appears. But for ancient humans, the interesting thing often had to come from somewhere else. It had to come from the group, or from the environment, or from the imagination. If there was no story to hear, someone could tell one. If there was no music, someone could make a sound. If there was no game, children could invent one. If there was nothing beautiful to look at, perhaps someone could create something beautiful. That is a completely different relationship with boredom. And it may explain why creativity feels so closely connected to moments when there is nothing demanding our attention. Because creativity needs space. A thought has to survive long enough to become another thought. An image has to remain in your mind long enough for you to change it. A strange idea has to be allowed to exist without immediately being replaced by something louder. Ancient humans had something we rarely experience now: long stretches of undivided time. Time while walking, time while waiting, time beside a fire, time under the stars, time when the only entertainment available was another human being or the contents of your own mind. And that could sometimes be terrifying. Remember, ancient life was not a peaceful vacation. Free time existed alongside hunger, injury, disease, conflict, predators, and uncertainty. Boredom was not proof that life was easy. It simply meant that survival did not require constant physical activity every second of every day. There were pauses, and inside those pauses, human culture had room to grow. Maybe someone practiced drawing an animal until the lines began to resemble movement. Maybe someone discovered that striking two objects together produced a pleasing rhythm. Maybe a child made an object that had no practical use and kept it simply because they liked the way it looked. Maybe someone sat silently for a long time and imagined a world beyond the horizon. None of these moments would look important at the time, but history is often built from moments that nobody recognizes as history while they are happening. The first person who shaped an ordinary object into something beautiful probably did not know they were contributing to the future of art. The first person who repeated a rhythm probably did not know they were participating in the origins of music. The first person who exaggerated a story to make everyone laugh probably did not know that humans would one day build entire industries around entertainment. They were just trying to make the evening less boring. And that may be the strangest part of all. Your ancestors were not sitting around waiting for civilization to arrive. They were creating it while trying to pass the time. Because civilization, when you strip away the monuments and the inventions and the names of kings, is really just accumulated human behavior. It is millions of people doing things that were not strictly necessary for staying alive. Singing when silence would have been enough, decorating objects that already worked perfectly, telling stories about people who never existed, playing games with rules everyone agreed to pretend were real. And ancient humans were doing versions of all of this long before there were theaters, books, stadiums, or television. Take games, for example. We tend to think of games as a modern luxury, something you do after the important work is finished. But play is much older than civilization. Children almost certainly played long before written history, because play is one of the ways humans learn without being directly taught. You don't need a classroom to discover competition. You don't need a rule book to race someone. You don't need a board game to invent a challenge. Who can throw a stone the farthest? Who can hit that target? Who can climb there first? Who can remember the longest story? Who can make everyone laugh? These simple challenges could turn an ordinary afternoon into an event. And over time, repeated games could become traditions, with skills, rules, rivalries, and memories attached to them. The people involved may not have called it entertainment. They were simply doing what humans have always done when given time and other people. They competed, they copied, they experimented, they laughed. And laughter itself deserves more attention than it usually gets. Because laughter has almost no obvious survival value if you look at it purely as a physical activity. It doesn't build a shelter, it doesn't catch an animal, it doesn't make a spear sharper. Yet humans devote an astonishing amount of time to making one another laugh. Imagine how ancient humor must have worked. There were no recorded comedians, no written jokes, no stage lights. Humor had to live entirely in memory. Someone said something funny, another person repeated it. The story became exaggerated. A person's mistake from 10 years ago became funnier every time it was retold. And through laughter, groups became closer. This matters because ancient humans did not survive alone. The individual human is not particularly impressive compared with the predators around them. We don't have claws. We don't have powerful jaws. We can't outrun most animals over short distances. What made us dangerous was cooperation. And cooperation depends on relationships. Relationships depend on communication. And communication becomes stronger when people enjoy being around each other. So when ancient humans were sitting around doing what appears to be absolutely nothing important, laughing at stories and teasing one another, they may actually have been strengthening the invisible network that kept everyone alive. Boredom created opportunities for social connection, and social connection created stronger groups. Stronger groups survived. But boredom may also have produced something much more personal. Self-reflection. For most of the day, ancient people had immediate problems demanding their attention. Find food, watch the children, avoid danger, repair a tool, follow the group. But eventually there were quiet moments when none of those things required immediate action. And what happens when the outside world becomes quiet? The inside world gets louder. You remember, you regret, you imagine, you worry, you hope, you replay a conversation, you think about someone who died, you wonder what tomorrow will bring. In other words, the ancient human sitting silently beside a fire may have experienced something surprisingly familiar. They may have overthought. They may have worried about the future. They may have replayed embarrassing moments. They may have imagined conversations that never happened. The difference is that they had nowhere to scroll afterward. They had to sit with the thought. And perhaps that changed what thoughts became. A thought that would disappear after 10 seconds of modern distraction might have remained in the ancient mind for hours. It could be examined, repeated, shared with someone else, turned into a story, or transformed into an idea. That doesn't mean boredom was always pleasant. Far from it. An idle mind can create fear just as easily as creativity. Imagine hearing something outside the firelight when you have no idea what made the sound. Your imagination immediately begins creating possibilities. A predator, an enemy, a spirit, something unknown. For ancient humans, the unknown was everywhere. And when humans don't have an answer, we are remarkably good at inventing one. Sometimes those explanations became practical knowledge. That sound means danger. Those clouds mean rain. Those tracks belong to a particular animal. But sometimes the explanation went beyond what anyone could prove. Perhaps there was something living in the darkness. Perhaps the dead were still watching. Perhaps the stars were sending messages. Perhaps thunder was the voice of something powerful. Again, we cannot say that boredom alone created religion. Human beliefs are far too complex for that. But the long stretches of time spent thinking, talking, remembering, and imagining gave humans something incredibly important: the opportunity to ask questions without immediate answers. And once a species begins asking those questions, it becomes very difficult to stop. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What happens when we die? Why does the sun return? Why do people get sick? Why does the world sometimes feel unfair? These are not survival questions in the immediate sense. You can survive perfectly well without answering them. But humans wanted answers anyway, maybe because a quiet mind dislikes empty spaces. And when there is no answer available, imagination walks in and begins decorating the emptiness. That may be one of the most human things we do. We turn uncertainty into stories. We turn silence into music. We turn empty objects into art. We turn time into games. And sometimes when we have absolutely nothing to do, we turn our attention toward the biggest mysteries imaginable. So perhaps ancient humans didn't really kill boredom at all. Maybe boredom was doing something to them. Maybe every empty afternoon, every long walk, every quiet night beside the fire was slowly training the human brain to search for something beyond immediate survival. Something interesting, something beautiful, something meaningful. And generation after generation, those moments accumulated until human beings became a species surrounded by the products of its own imagination. The first decoration led to more decoration. The first rhythm led to more complex music. The first story led to myths. Myths led to traditions. Traditions shaped cultures. Cultures built civilizations. And somewhere near the beginning of that enormous chain, there may simply have been a person sitting around with time on their hands, looking at an ordinary object and wondering, what else could this be? So, how did ancient humans kill boredom? They didn't have smartphones, they didn't have movies, games, social media, or an endless supply of entertainment designed to capture every second of their attention. But perhaps that was exactly the point. When there was nothing left to consume, they began to create. They played, they laughed, they talked, they told stories around the fire. They made music from bone and wood. They decorated their bodies and carved meaning into ordinary objects. And when the world became quiet, they did something that may have changed our species forever. They imagined. Of course, boredom alone did not invent art, music, religion, or civilization. Human history is far more complicated than that. But boredom created something incredibly valuable: space. Space for the mind to wander, space to connect memories, space to imagine dangers that had not happened yet, and possibilities that had never existed before. A person sitting beside a fire tens of thousands of years ago may have looked bored by modern standards, but inside their mind, something extraordinary could have been happening. They might have been remembering the past, planning for tomorrow, inventing a story, creating a rhythm, wondering what was beyond the mountains, or looking into the darkness and asking the same questions we still ask today. Why are we here? What happens next? What else is possible? And perhaps that is the real lesson. For most of human history, we could not escape boredom. We had to sit with it. And instead of destroying us, those empty moments may have helped create some of the things that made us human. Today, the moment boredom appears, we reach for a screen. We fill the silence. We replace the empty moment before our minds have a chance to do anything with it. But maybe, just maybe, the next time you're sitting somewhere with nothing to do, your phone out of reach and your mind beginning to wander, you shouldn't rush to stop it. Because thousands of years ago, someone else sat in the same silence. And from that silence came stories, music, art, ideas, imagination. Ancient humans didn't simply kill boredom, they turned it into something. And maybe that is why boredom has never really been the enemy. Maybe the empty moment is where being human truly begins.